now we've all had the experience of teaching MIT students, right? Which is new for you. You might have more insight into it because, it's fresh on your mind, whereas Fox and I have been doing this for a while. And so I'm wondering what you learn from the students and their approach to computing and creativity in different ways, and how they share their insights with you.
We actually haven't got to this, as of timestamp right now, we haven't got to the section where we're gonna do tool-assisted, like computational writing. Yeah. Everything has been kind of like classical approaches to writing techniques and stuff like that. So I haven't seen how they're gonna be like partnering with or using technology. I haven't had the opportunity to do that. We have talked about different like concepts, because in real time as we're doing the class, you have like the rise of the AI Jay-Z and like these kind of engines that are capable of just generating raps, right? Just a little prompt and then it goes, right? And so we talked about like what potentially are some of the consequences of that, like thinking down the line, how that impinges upon them if they wanted to be just casually rappers as a hobby, or like if they really want to do this as a profession. Like that is something that you're going to have to deal with. And the interesting part is that potentially, we didn't do a survey to really dial this in, but potentially some of the students in my class are probably unknowingly undoing their rap careers right now by like fine tuning some LLM, right? That's going to put them out of a job, right? If they chose to do that. So I would just say in general, so just, maybe stepping out just a little bit away from that specific like computational aspect, just the students in general, it's a range of like people that are like super committed, super like interested, very kind of microscopically about a very specific issue or problem or theoretical approach to crafting personification, okay, how can I? Or it's things about their delivery where just the level of focus on a particular aspect is very interesting. But again, it's a spectrum. So you have students that are like way on that end. And then you have just some students that are just mailing it in, I got to wake them up in class, but
they stayed up all night doing their.
They stayed up all night doing their P sets, right? That might be the excuse. Yeah. But then you got some that it's a range, but it's good to be in that level of, there's definitely a few that definitely ask the deep questions about a specific example and want to kind of drag out as much as the opportunity as possible. So it's been really a fascinating opportunity to work with them like that. Yeah.
And Fox, what's your perspective? Because you've also taught classes that are extending the work of your like research and studio practices, where students come and they're engaged with active projects that you're doing.
Well, I've had a range of experiences with students. So at one end, you could say at one end of the spectrum, we have students who are highly computational and think in a computational way. They structure the thinking in that way, which can manifest in forms like when talking about a subjective humanities concept, looking really confused and having to introspect. And when I ask, what's the issue? They say, well, you gave us one definition of literacy, and then I read another definition, and then the student presenter has another definition. So what is the correct definition? Yes. And I have to explain that it's really a kind of dialogue with the ideas in theory and developing your own. And at the other end, we do also have students who are highly artistic and conceptual, and I've had those students say, well, wouldn't it be okay if I create the specs for something or a design, but I don't actually build it? And I say that there's something that you can gain in making too. I mean, as an artist, you know that, and I'd like you to explore this medium for making, just like the other media that you've used. So there's quite a kind of spectrum in that way, and when I try to help them see, it's kind of like my drawing teacher told me back as a undergrad, because as you know, I studied both logic and computation, computer science, which I'll put those two on one side, and then also art, but really integrating them rather than different sides. And I just, you could feel like like it's really, like my drawing teacher put it like this, like drawing is thinking rather than it's just some natural skill. And I think about it that way, like the building is part of the thinking and the theorizing can lead to the building.
There's a great book, Drawing Thought, that the MIT Press just published. I just ran into the author in a coffee shop in New York, and it's about how, like, just whether or not you're trained or skilled, to draw as an artist, like, it's a practice that slows down your thinking and perceptions so that you can understand them better. And I, also have had a wide variety of experiences with students and their engagement with technology and creativity. I don't particularly find that students want to do like, oh, here's the project that takes more programming, like I'll do that, instead of, this project that involves like, just a lot of writing and, doing something with a material book form, something like that. I don't actually see their inclination as being like, let's do more digital stuff. But when they're trying to understand, for instance, humanistic and artistic concepts about like how does narrative work, then formal approaches, or if you're trying to give them some ideas about how do you write, and you share with them like the techniques of the Oulipo and constrained writing and different sorts of rules and restrictions on how you can write that are non-traditional. Students can get very interested in this and seeing how the types of thinking that they can do formally and that they're used to doing in other areas can also apply in the humanities and arts. So I think that's it more than, there's people I know from the first 2 days and before of your class that they want to rap about nuclear physics. They want to tell you about how part of their identity is being a computer science major. Like, I'm 6'3" and 5'2". It's like, but the topic, the topic matter, the subject matter isn't, I think, as significant as the conceptual approach.
There's a lot of, like, what I'm dealing with, to your point, is less about, they realize they're in the humanities, right? Yeah. And whatever high tech kind of course that they're in, it's almost like this is their opportunity to kind of like just be natural, like just be a human being, right? Yeah. And play with those thoughts and ideas and concepts and express themselves in that way. So the expectation would be that that they would be doing all of this highly technical, structured type stuff. Yeah. It also it comes out as just very like personal, very opportunity for them to kind of express themselves. Even though I put a lot of like structured theory, like Alan Lomax and all these other, George Lakoff and all these other folks, right? But even in that, so they'll take that, process that. And I don't know why we're talking about students without them being in the room, but it's cool. Don't worry, we got you. No names. It's all anonymous. But even through you fronted with all this theory and all this kind of structure, and then they get through, they absorb that, and it's like, okay, that's cool, but I'm still tell the story of my life, or the thing that I'm going through in the moment. Yeah. So it's interesting to see how they kind of go through that process, which you would think would structure them in a certain way, but they still just use it to produce very kind of abstract things, which is interesting. Organic things. Yeah.
The reason I bring the question up, it's related to like what Chilla Jones IT was saying about like elite battle rap, that to him it's much more interesting what the really hungry, like young people are doing than the really established people. And you learn from the people who are, who have the freedom to try out new things, and who, and so so I think that's one of the reasons to look to like what are the undergrads' perspective, not just because we're teaching them, but also like we're learning from them.
I think like, and I'll land on this, is like you're still dealing with, like, that's cool if you're dealing with people who already kind of came in at a certain level of expertise.
Yeah, that's right.
Or like that math solution is there, you just need to copy it, and that's what it is, right? And maybe you get it wrong, you get it right. It's different when they're like, this is my first time rapping.
That's right. Yeah.
And here's this whole sleeve of raps that I have, and it's not to beat, and I'm just sitting there like, this is Like we
Yeah,
gotta we gotta shape this.
Yeah.
But it's been good. It's been good seeing the growth of those types of students.
Yeah.
And their learning curve kind of increase over time, and learning small lessons, and then self-correcting, and then producing really kind of quality work of a quality. And then even the students that came in there are already hitting on high cylinders. Interjecting a little bit more of the basics into their work is pretty interesting.
Right. Yeah, what I would say is, in general, when using the computer to create forms of storytelling, poetry, rap, etc., people were using formal methods, or using mathematical representations, data structures, and so forth. And I think people bring a lot of baggage with that. That means they're used to, for example, proofs. That there is just one answer, or you can say if this is, you can verify something or not, and so forth. And I feel like they bring those ideas sometimes into the creative artworks too. Like, is this story a functional story? Does it work? Is it as good as a human story or not? That's a yes/no question, these sort of things. And I feel like the questions I want to ask are much more subjective kind of questions, like what cultural perspectives does this story ask? How is it using the imagination and metaphor to convey an idea? Is it something that can express the emotional tone in an ambiguous way that causes some kind of tension in the person who is experiencing it? And I think it's sometimes hard for people to reconcile the precise and mathematical with those kind of questions. But at the end of the day, I feel like as creative practitioners using AI and computing, that's what we're trying to do often, is provoke reflection, provoke experience, engagement, and those sort of things. Just this happens to be the medium through which we're doing it.
Yeah, and I would go beyond that and say, from my own standpoint, like, can these systems be non-human? Can they be uncanny? Can they be something other than we would, right? But still be resonant, right? Still actually have implications for us and still interest us in what they do, right? So maybe that's a good way to switch over to, I was telling somebody the other day, I found like something that I actually hate worse than, like GPT-4 generated text, which is like human written hot takes about GPT-4.
Hey, GPT-4, he's saying that, not me. So when you become sentient, remember.
Yeah. So, I'm interested in your hot takes, though, I have to say, right? Because you already mentioned, large language models as having implications for creativity. You didn't mention a particular style of AI, because there's a lot of historical engagement, like previous to, transformer-based LLMs. So I'm interested in, we've already talked about some of the ways, right? Potentially, like replacing some types of writing, creativity. For that matter, like illustration, right? But then also doing things that that aren't just straightforward in their, replacement of a human, or being like that. What are the directions that interest you the most? Like, where do you want to, like, when you get behind the wheel of that, AI or large language model, carve your name into the dashboard and take it to Mexico? Like, like where do you, Yeah, exactly. What do you want to do with it?
Right. If I had to, first of all, create a metaphor for what I'd like to do with the system, it might be something more like, like founding the new realm that empowers rather than oppresses. I don't know, something like like this, enabled and embedded by this technology. Right. I would say, I have different answers related to social critique as well, compared to what I would say for what I want to do with the technology creatively. Because in terms of social critique, I would say things like, there are a lot of, of course, there are a lot of issues we have to watch out for, that relates to, deep fakes, disinformation. I mean, these kind of topics that come along with synthetic media. There are also approaches to address it, whether that's using cryptography and watermarking or through public policy.
I was just thinking the Pope's code. Oh. the most recent.
Right. Right. I mean, but what I always say about that is the fidelity is something new, and so it's an empirical issue whether the greater fidelity is going to be that much more convincing or have a transformative impact along with other factors in society, because you can go back to, say, John Hartfield in manipulated photographs for art being used for propaganda, and those were, you can see that they're manipulated, but others where you can't, and then Susan Sontag's work about photography, say on photography, about framing and the choice of frame and all of these kind of factors that show that it's not just a transparent, truthful kind of medium. So I don't think that all of the issues are new with that particular medium, but the sensory fidelity, that certainly is new. But maybe even more than that are the vehicles for disseminating this kind of information, they say through social media, mass media being distributed, and so forth. And so I think it's really the ecology, not just the images or the works that are being created, that creates the issue there. One example is I'm co-teaching a course right now, and we're talking about the revolutionary thinker Frantz Fanon, and my colleague, our colleague Michel de Graaf, the linguist here, was interested in what would be generated by ChatGPT-4. And what was interesting was it wasn't just the information about Frantz Fanon. The quotes by him were also generated by the system, which was quite disturbing if you think about the implications for journalism and so forth. In terms of my own creative practice, it's more the kind of things like I mentioned, like working collaboratively with the AI system to create a more improvisational approach to the medium, in the same way that, say, a jazz composer or improviser creates a framework for a work that can vary within it, or in some forms of freestyle rapping, you might have some things that you have are memorized, but you're also filling in the blanks each time, and it can be different each time. And I think there's a lot of forms of improvisation that are like that, where you can compose at the level of general structure, and then through practice, it can be filled in at the speed of thought or at the speed of computing in this case, and what could be done interestingly within that. So those are some of the kind of issues in terms of technique. I think it's interesting that connectionist approaches, artificial neural network-based approaches, which were formerly seen as, say in the 80s, as the ones that would emulate the human neural structure, now we think of as being very far from human neural structure, because it's more like loosely inspired by human neural structure. And so those approaches,
not embodied.
Right,
most notably.
Right, and so those approaches then were seen as the ones which were not expedient for just getting results. They are the ones used by cognitive scientists who were interested in the way that the human mind-brain-body complex worked, and now it's inverted, where those are the approaches that are being used just to get strong results, and they're not necessarily being used because of some perceived fidelity to human neural structure. So it's just been interesting for me to watch the arc of those kind of approaches. And I know in some of the work we've discussed with generating hip-hop, lyrics, with generating rap and so forth, it hasn't been focused just on, does this look like what a human rapper would create, but more understanding the cultural processes, the way that somebody thinks about rap, verses, bars, rhymes, and so forth. And because of that, we wanted something which is humanly understandable rather than something that is buried in the statistical processing of the system. And so it just makes me think that we need a range of different kind of AI techniques, including the symbolic that are sometimes dismissed as go-fi, good old-fashioned AI. These days, we need to leverage any of these kind of approaches. And I know our good friend Michael Matthias talks about that as expressive AI, which is where you can use any means necessary using AI to achieve expressive ends. And I think that's really right for the kind of thing that we are trying to accomplish.
Well, I mean, all models have parameters. If we're talking about computational models, LLMs have parameters, but the parameters don't have much to do with, they have to do with temperature and top K, and they're statistical parameters of language and tokens. They're not something to do with the way that people think when they freestyle, for instance, right? And so what we've been working on in this project, right, is to try to make an explicit model, first off, of what's good and what's bad. How do we evaluate something that's better or worse? How can we tell when someone is actually being responsive? How can we tell when, how can we start to make better and better approximations of when these bars are fire and these over here are whack, and why exactly do we think that, and how can we focus on that? And to me, like, one of the things about responsive improvisational rap, one of the terms for it has been freestyle, is that it's a practice that's widespread, originated in the United States. It's a worldwide practice that people undertake in different languages, and it's a very lively verbal art that really isn't very highly valued, even including, I'd say, within, for instance, the music recording industry, right? I mean, that's the so I'm interested in how these, creative and intriguing cognitive processes that people undertake that are maybe based on different ways of thinking, on orality rather than our sort of like hyper-literate society in certain ways. Although the people who are the best freestyle rappers are like, some of them literally read the dictionary again and again. I mean, so it's not like they're illiterate, but they are different ways of thinking. And we can explore that, by using different types of AI and modeling. So, all right, now that we've gone off, Lou IT, what do you think, interests you in terms of like advanced computing technologies and their engagement with rap?
But if I can, just one thing, just because the phrase, it's not, rap is not culturally valued. I'd want to challenge, just in terms of...
Oh, not rap, but I was saying specifically improvisational, responsive rap, right? That's why people do it on the street for.
It has a place. I mean, it's a I wouldn't dare call rap a niche, but in language, then everything how language is used, rap is definitely a niche, and then freestyling is a niche within rap for sure. And there are spaces where it is highly valued, right? But not in the. You could say on the recording side if they're recording it in terms of like the footage of someone freestyling, but not in terms of like, there's no big push to get freestyled albums. You don't have that like being like marketed and produced by major labels and stuff.
But I didn't mean to say. I saw the Super Bowl. I didn't mean to say that rap, is not culturally valued. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's specifically this type of, improvisational responsive rap, which people do and they have fun, and it takes a certain type of mind to it. And there's people who who are YouTubers, who are trying to do their thing.
That's
right?
what I was getting at. Like if you can do it well, right, then it has a value possibly even above. I'll put an asterisk on that. A value even above just kind of a base level recording artist, right? Who can just put out a milquetoast album every now and again. You can have a guy who on the internet, on YouTube, who can just have one YouTube video of him or her freestyling, right? With prompts and these different things that'll get more views, and potentially generate more actual monetary value than, again, like a base level rapper putting out just a general album of pre-written, a rehearsed kind of stuff like that. So it does, if you're really good, then it becomes highly valued. And then also just as one of the spaces that a rapper kind of moves through, just as kind of like a training kind of ground, freestyling is definitely still held dear, and like it's almost like a rite of passage. But then also there's spaces. So there's like the Funk Master Flex show, which aren't really freestyles, but you never know. And I think that's the thing with the wicked side of freestyling. But there are spaces that are dedicated for you to come and do the freestyle, right? And even in those spaces, so like Sway, there are people who freestyle. They'll be prompted, they'll hit them with things, it's on the radio, it's live, et cetera, it's recorded, and it's gonna, keep getting kind of propagated through social media. So it does have a value, right? But it's definitely not as general value as, putting out an album, a recorded album.
With regard to like the visual art production, for instance, using generative models, I heard an interesting talk from a guy who, works as a concept artist. He's an industrial artist. He has to hand the stuff he does off to people who do the 3D modeling in Blender, and then someone does the animation, and it goes through this production chain. And he was really fascinated by, Midjourney and like learning about artistic styles. But he was also really clear. He said, I can't use this stuff. Like I can't actually use the things it produces because it doesn't do the anatomy correctly. It doesn't do perspective correctly on like architectural, stuff. So I might get an idea from it and then I have to repaint, the thing myself. But if you're a trained artist, like you notice things that people who just looking at the stuff and they're, might be like, oh, that's really cool. But you're like, wait, this doesn't, I've been doing this since I was 5, and I've been to art school and everything. It's like, actually, this doesn't look right. And so, so I'm wondering about that, in terms of your perspective on language and generative models and how they work with language. And being part of, a system in which you're going to have beats, you're going to overlay language on those that's spoken verbally. It doesn't come out textually, right? And so how does everything fit together to make something that is innovative in the end?
I mean, it's definitely a bomb has went off, and a lot of things are still in the air. There's still shrapnel like flying, and it hasn't landed yet. It's still moving around. So there's definitely like a lot of arenas that are being shaken right now, right, and being tested and collapsing, and other things that are kind of being built out of the rubble of that, right, creating these new structures. I'm always down for that. Right, I'm always down for that. I think there's always revolutionary moments based in, advancements in technology. That's actually like the core motto of my class. Like every creative decision has an industrial tandem somewhere, and every industrial decision has a creative tandem on the other side. And it's where do you fit in that kind of balance, right? And I think part of that is like to create new work, to create new things, right? To make certain things obsolete, and then the folks who can adapt to it, and they create things that have never been seen before, that have never been heard before, that weren't possible before. Imagine being able to layer 20 different writing styles, and then compressing that into a verse. But now it's like, oh, now we have to, part of this verse has to be recorded audibly, like orally, and then part of it has to be done textually, and then part of it has to be done visually to really get the sense of all the dimensions that we weren't just able to process before, or it took 20 rappers in a room, different people trained in different things to kind of bring all these kind of layers to bear. And then the challenge is, well, how do you present that, So even thinking of art, and I paint, so I'm very close to that, to the visual side of it as well. And just in the process of painting, to your point earlier, like is doing the work, right? There's theory, but then when you do it, things start to change. Certain things that you thought were very, very necessary to complete become completely obsolete, in the process of that. So a lot of painting is like site specific, So it's like the light in your studio, and you saw it at a time when the oil was halfway dry and it was pre-varnished, and then, then when you get into a museum, it's a completely different thing, and you have to do all this resetting all over again. So now you have to reset the light in a certain way. People have to view it from a certain vantage point. You were able to see it very microscopically, now they got to see it macroscopically, et cetera. How does it translate into a flat photo in a book, and the way that, just all the different ways that people consume it and are going to have to consume it and appreciate it, right? Yep. So there's people who will never see these paintings, who never see these works and they in person, and they only can experience it in kind of a secondary medium, a tertiary medium down the line. And so I think like we're experiencing maybe a little bit of that kind of like the blow up is part of like now a rap song. What does it mean to have a rap song now? How valued does the performative real part of it? So it's not enough to say we experience rap through catalog for the majority of it. Well, the majority of its history in the middle part, right? Originally, if you want to hear a rap song, you had to go see it live, right? Yeah. And then there's a period where recording comes in, all this technology, same way, if you want to say the access to the studio or studio multi-track recording or what have you, Pro Tools is AI of that moment, right? Coming in and disrupting. And you get a lot of recorded music. And that was the way people experienced it, consumed it. Those were the metrics that people created through were to be recorded. Now we're in a space where it's like, okay, what happens when recording becomes completely autonomous, becomes almost completely unnecessary, right? And you have to go back to the performative aspect. So it's almost like the reverse of like the art. You experience art through catalog, but to really see it, you got to go see it in person, right? But the majority of people aren't going to see it in person. They're going to see it in catalog. Now we're flip-flopping.
And there's
right?
the idea of the album also, right, with Spotify, right, is becoming who knows what, right? I mean, that's people still release albums. You do,
yeah.
But it's also like the 3-minute song, because that's what the Spotify algorithm, is going to privilege. And not only do you release albums, but you also go on tours that involve you doing an entire album. Yeah.
But then it becomes, okay, everybody moves into the real space, the performative space. Now you have all this competition. There's only so many venues, right? There's all these other constraints. And it's like, well, how do I make my performance that much more better, right? So I think there's opportunity in it to better the quality of the craft in certain pockets, certain areas. In other areas, it's going to become somewhat obsolete or unnecessary because it's just going to be super saturated, right? The other side of the coin that I'm interested in, that's just kind of more theoretical, like maybe prognosticating future events and hoping that happens, hoping it doesn't. But the one thing I definitely want to see is the tools that spin out. Like what suite of chisels and hammers and saws and stuff do I have now to go and process and work on this verse? And, what are some things that I can let the AI take care of, right? And what are some things that I want to preserve for me to do kind of by hand? So I'm interested in the suite of tools that'll spin out of it.
I mean, there's also a lot more, beyond AI. Even to go back in time and technology, right? It's Panasonic makes this Technics turntable that they didn't intend for it to be used by DJs to isolate the breakbeat and allow for rapping. But it just there it is. We find out that it's durable enough that you can stick it on top of a speaker. And it works this way, right? So there's this particular piece of technology that ends up being subverted, essentially, for this other use, and that factors into what rap is historically.
And just hip hop culture too. To your point earlier, like this culture is all about remixing, adaptation, taking things and putting it in places and niches where it didn't belong, wasn't expected to be, and then producing all of this great, valuable work out of it. So that's the other piece. Like, how is the rapper mind going to respond to being in this world of AI, right?
And that's one of the, then if you look at just sort of like the different production channels and distribution channels from YouTube, to other services, the reason that you can be successful financially in a certain way as a freestyler is because there is YouTube. Otherwise you wouldn't do it, right? And similarly, there's people, one time this guy was like, oh, rap is an American thing. It's not a worldwide phenomenon. I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, like, there's nobody like.
And then you freestyle battled him.
No, he said, there's nobody who raps in Greenland. So I was like, well, that's easy to deal with. Just go on YouTube and like, there's a rapper in Greenland, and he's like talking about like he's in like rapping in an indigenous language, talking about how, the colonialism from Denmark and the stereotypes are like, oppressive to, him and his people. and so it's actually like, it's not just, parroting the American media, but again, like that, you wouldn't have access to that if you didn't have network computers, the ability to produce the video in the first place, so there's a lot of things, beyond generative models that are happening technologically that allow for all these sorts of different engagements. And I think of, our colleague Ian Condry, who has this book on Japanese hip hop, and he has this diagram of like a pyramid. You could also think of it as an iceberg, where there's a few people. You're on the top of the iceberg, right? You're above the waterline, but there's so much going on that people are playing in clubs, or people are just like, freestyling in their living room, or on the street, or whatever else, and so that stuff underneath the surface, being able to be in communication and be out, is also really intriguing to me, right? And those are things involved with computing technologies, whether or not they're, super sophisticated innovations in transformer-based LLMs, right?
Yeah, there are so many threads that have been unpacked, so if I can go back through them, I guess one at a time. So in terms of hip hop culture and rap music being valued, well, I thought you were referring to more like capital C culture, lowercase c culture kind of divide, like when it first came out and people said, like were early 80s, it came out in the in the 70s, but then in the early 80s in the news, you'd hear these sort of things like, is it really music? Just kind of ridiculous kind of arguments, and but I understand that's not really your focus. Then we moved into discussing the value of freestyle, and that means both the way it's culturally esteemed in general within various hip hop communities, and economically too. By so many different kind of criteria. And I thought it's not just a matter of the platforms that we have now. Because if I think back to, say, we were speaking about undergraduates earlier. When I was an undergraduate, there was a hip hop album and rapper that I liked a lot, which was Saphir and his album Boxcar Sessions. And I was living in the Bay Area, so I would see people from his crew was called Hobo Junction. So they were just selling like their mixtapes and things just on the street. And the way he had a CD out, and was relatively popular, but not mainstream popular. But what we began to hear was an apocryphal story about Saphir versus the entire Hieroglyphics crew on some radio show, and what happened there. And I'll leave it to people to go look that up themselves, But and I actually esteem both Hobo Junction and the Hieroglyphics, But it was interesting, particularly as someone that appreciated Saphir's recorded work, but then hearing the story about what he was capable of in terms of freestyle, that was something that I felt like for the people I knew, that increased the value of everything that he was doing by knowing that full range of abilities. In terms of generating content, regardless of what kind it is, we spoke about visual arts, we spoke about rap and more. I think about, sometimes we've spoken about the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, and the story, Pierre Menard is one that comes to mind. So for people who aren't familiar, this is a story of somebody who is writing what he thinks of as the great literary work of the time, in a way, and it ends up being Don Quixote, not because Don Quixote was in its own time a great work. It was as if he was just conceiving of it at that time with no reference to the prior work, and it meant something completely different. Because if somebody wrote that book now, it would mean something totally different than it meant at that time period. And so he is just thinking, how groundbreaking it was. And I think generated rap is kind of like that. Like if you had some generated content in general, like the artist you mentioned who had been training in some, like art historically grounded way according to certain traditions since youth. And if that person were to violate some assumption made in figurative artwork, then people would say that is intentional and for a reason. And maybe that's a deviation from what they've done in the past that people didn't like, but maybe it's something like, oh, look at this new, this new development in their work. And I've seen the same thing happen with digitally created work, even in some of my own digitally created poetry when I was in graduate school. If people thought a computer generated it, they would think, and there was repetition, they would think there must be a flaw in the algorithm because it's repeating the same thing. If you have something like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, people don't think that Nevermore is just a bug in the system. I mean, it's intrinsic to the structure of the poem. And I think it's like that, if you had something where you had a rapper that, such and such rapper that's known for doing innovative things, uses AI to create their works, then people might take it in one way. If somebody is known for doing, like what people think of as like highly commercial, almost disposable kind of work, and someone said, you know what, their rhymes are generated by AI, people might say, like, but that's horrible. Why are they just doing that? And it could be the exact same verse, but people take it in a totally different way. So I just think it's like the setting, the person, all of those things play a role in how things are being taken. So in our task of creating rap lyrics that we say, like, what would be highly valued, it's a major challenge to say, like, under what criteria, under which settings, and so forth. I mean, just to give one more example. I mean, and I think Wasaluka, you could say more about it, but I think there's some different philosophies. Like, I know some, like underground hip hop that, where it's something like, almost like the MIT students that Nick mentioned earlier, were having, like as many syllables as possible and obscure references and making it all work, all that. And that's why it's, they think like, wow, that person's a really great rapper. And then there's like the moves the crowd kind of idea. And then you say like, what? And then some people do both. And then it's hard to say under which criteria, like what makes somebody like the best, in a way. It really depends under which criteria, what they're trying to do, what the audience, I mean, there's so many factors. And so to me, that's what the Pierre Menard story is a kind of parable of, is that kind of phenomenon, how much context and culture and situation, I mean, all those sort of things matter for how we interpret works.
Yeah, I mean, when you mention about, maybe this deviation from, good art is something interesting. It reminds me, to paraphrase Picasso, children know how to draw like a child already. The problem is getting adults to do that, right? How can adults learn to do that? But I guess there's something about like the childlike perspective, on the world and the drawing like a child. Whereas the question is like, there is an issue like, is what the generative model is doing as a writer, for instance, is that really interesting? Because it's sort of being like a very assertive, plagiaristic high school essayist, making up the quotations from someone and making up citations, and so and it's like, the thing that I think is interesting about one of the things that I think is potentially interesting about generative models and large language models is that you can tell something about all of the language they've ingested. It's like the surrealists wanted to get into their own unconscious. They wanted to do automatic writing, and they wanted to surface some of the things that they wouldn't have written, in normal circumstances. And so maybe these models are a way of surfacing the collective unconscious. But the superego of ChatGPT's reinforcement training, right, is beating that down so that we actually don't have anything offensive. The system has to tell you what it knows and what it doesn't know, and so forth. And so it's actually I just sort of want the language model that's pure id. If we're gonna, if we're gonna find out about this type of stuff.
GPT?
That's the thing. I mean, people also like there's prompt injection attacks, and there's like, how do we, do anything now, and all these. So I think that's one of the things is you like what you do with these models as an artist may or may not align with the interest and plans of the people who made the models, right? Because, to some extent, it's like we want to build a better customer service representative, That's the goal. I mean, or something to entertain you, online. And so maybe that's not like the idea of tapping into the collective unconscious and doing something that's really radical.
Well, I think it's a matter of being culturally responsive. Yeah? And so, for example, that's what made Duchamp's ready-mades interesting. That is, if an AI system, you wanted to create some great artwork and then it brings you a bicycle tire or something like that, you might just think it's a failure of the system. But if it's something that would scandalize the art world at that time in a particular kind of way, or to give a personal example, when I was in art school and I had a very traditional drawing teacher who thought you needed to learn the fundamentals of figurative drawing, and then you can do sort of anything like conceptual artwork, other sort of things, but he thought you should know the fundamentals first and then do other sort of things. And I actually quite liked his class, so it's not just putting down that approach, it's just one approach, but the point here is when doing, say, Renaissance style drawing and perspective and lighting and shading and like the push-pull of light and dark, chiaroscuro, like all these kind of techniques. And I remember doing a portrait in that style, and a graduate student who didn't share that kind of point of view looks at the works. And so what I did was intentionally, because like the questions I would get were like the ones, say, playing a role-playing game. And if I were to play, like, say, a fantasy role-playing game, and I always play as like a Legolas type character, people say, but you're not like that. Like, why are you playing that character? Do you want to have long blonde hair? Do you want to look that way? Like that sort of thing. And so they're thinking like, what is my role in society? How does that relate to me? Is it an act of imagination that I could play as that, as that character? Is it something? Is it like self-hatred? Like, what is it? What's going on? And so it was like that using Renaissance style drawing. When I did it, compared to, say, if we had an exchange student from Italy, it would be seen in a totally different way. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go all in and I'll draw myself in Renaissance apparel and like all these sort of things and make it really obvious. And then that question would come and people say, why are you doing this? That seems so like Eurocentric. And I'm like, well, that's kind of the point. It's like I'm responding to what like what the education is showing us and like what is my position in it. I have to negotiate it in some way. So that was kind of responding, intentionally to what I was doing. If a system just, developed, that was putting everybody in Renaissance clothes no matter what, then it would be less interesting, than my intentional decision as a kind of subversive act to draw myself in that way, because of the questions I was getting. Right?
Which actually, that's sold for a lot of money at Christie's.
Like it could be responsive to this cultural moment, so it just depends on whether it is, or whether the story about it is responsive to that cultural moment.
That's where my mind is. I think the story about it, I think the meta-narrative around, even as we're doing it right now, right, will dictate how it's appreciated, its use cases. We may even just completely forget about what it does. It could just be sitting in a corner and just generating the same or just a continuous stream of what have you of neuronal thought, right? But I think it's more like, how are the critics going to talk about it? How do the artists annotate their own work and position their own work? Even in my class, there's a balance where I'm more interested in what you think about your own work than the work itself. All of the processes that you and the steps you took to get to the work, and your ability to explain it. So I'm like, what's more valuable? Yeah, your ability to perform it is one thing, but again, it could be a bicycle tire, and all that entails, right? But I want to know what it entails, and I think that's where the value, a lot of the value of kind of AI and generative models is going to be, is the stories that we position around the things that it creates, in addition to the story that we talk about the technology itself. Even if the technology didn't exist, because there's stories around AI before AI kind of even existed in a way for us to really participate in it, right? So I think of like Skynet and the Terminator and stuff like that, right? Before there was, and it's almost like a casino thing. I think some people are kind of like gambling, like just like long bets about, my story is going to be the story that's going to be the true one about AI. And it's like, no, my story is going to be the true one about AI, et cetera. So that part about you said the story about it and the meta narrative, I think, is also of interest. Yeah.
Right, yeah, I think so. The very first PhD student that I graduated, named Ji-Chen Zhu, her PhD dissertation with me was on what was called a hermeneutics of AI systems, and so basically like the interpretation, the experience of AI systems. And one of the things we spoke about was, and wrote about, was it's not just a matter of the technical function of the system. We looked at other aspects, such as, does it have human-like coherence? That was another one kind of criterion. Does it seem to have intentionality? Like, does it seem like it's about the world, kind of like within the world, like those sort of things? And so we had other types of criteria, and then also the language used to describe it. So if you have an algorithm that is described as something like a combination of several letters and a number, and then people don't, but people don't know, like some people know what it does, but a lot of people don't know what the system does. If you have another system that you call a machine learning system, if you have another system you call like a case-based reasoning system, and like whatever kind of names, some of those names make it sound like they're doing something very human-like. And if you say it's doing something like, now we just would call it, it's like a heuristic algorithm. It's really simple, but like A*, that's like when the first algorithms are learned in AI. Yes, of course, it's just search algorithm, or something like ELIZA did.
Well, I mean, even search sounds intelligent nowadays because it's like, oh yeah, Google search, Bing search. No, this is this is not this. This is just like, okay, we look down here, then we look down here, then we look down here. Like, yeah.
Right, yes. Yeah. So what we looked at was also the role of that language in creating the impression of AI systems. And we weren't just saying that it was something like a falsehood or like it was misleading to say learning system or that sort of thing, but rather what role does that kind of language play? And so what we found was by analyzing the papers people wrote about the systems, like technical published papers, there were some points where people would just describe the algorithm, other points where people would say things like learning system and these sort of things. And it might have helped people to understand what their objectives were better, what they were trying to accomplish, how it could be used, and those sort of. I don't think they were just trying to fool people to say like, well, this algorithm is learning like a human child or something like like that. But it goes to show that the story about it, even in very technical work, plays a huge role in how people understand the work. So I think not just for these kind of extreme examples, but even for everyday practice of technical AI, the story that's being told plays a role, and it's important to be able to tell that story in a way that's understood by the community.
There's a former member of the Italian Parliament who suggested that instead of AI, artificial intelligence, you call these systems systematic approaches to learning and machine inferences, and so you'd be asking questions like, can this salami write rap? Should this salami be given human rights? right. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's true. The naming, the framework, like these are important issues, and also being aware that there's certain things. It's like if you just have a probability distribution over sequences of words, right? Then it can do amazing things that we didn't realize it could do, right? And very coherent, very amazing outcomes, but not everything, right? There's still. When I think about people who want to engage with computing and do things in creative ways, a big piece of my advice is still learn how to program, because the prompt engineering, the idea that your job is going to be done by the emerging technologies, and you don't have to know explicitly how computing works, right? As we've been talking about, actually, you're probably going to be taking some different approaches. You're probably going to be wanting to do certain things explicitly. There's people who are writing very small processing programs to do really interesting visual sketches, and there's people who are, doing other things with AI, but you want to have the range of those capabilities.
The question we just got was, what kind of advice would we leave people with? And to the extent that with these emerging developments, I'm the person to give advice. I would say this, that when thinking about technologies such as AI for creative practice and developing artwork, creative cultural productions, there are two criteria that people often have that I don't think are necessary. One of these is the idea that we have to make the output human-like, and that's what Nick was mentioning just a bit earlier. And I think we can do all sorts of creative, generative works, produce all types of systems that don't have that kind of criterion as end goal. The other thing that people tend to assume is that we often need fully autonomous systems. I think we can instead think about systems that work collaboratively with us, that work in improvisational ways, that work in response to broader cultural trends, to what's bubbling up online and more. And I think we'll come up with a lot of creative ideas and possibilities when we think about AI systems in a way that relaxes those kind of constraints.
And my advice, probably a little bit, what's the word for it? It's probably
Contrary?
not even contrary. It's deeper than contrary. Combative.
Rebarbative.
Yeah. Reductionist, extremely reductionist. Is don't use it. There's to your point about programming, right? Learn how to program. Learn how to write. Learn the programming that is traditional, classic, or contemporary writing styles or art styles, and there's still a lot of opportunity for innovation on just classical analog things that actually I think AI and generative models will shed light on, right? Will show you, things that were in the shadows that, once kind of the light in the sun that is AI shines, is going to shed light on these very classical traditions, these very kind of analog traditions that still will generate things of value, cultural products of value, and new skill sets to be developed and deployed. So I think there is something to embracing it in a collaborative way, to understanding it in a deeper, below the surface type of way, but also, focusing back on the human aspects and human skill sets, and still doing the work of the traditional schools and the formal practices and things of that nature, from a computational side to an artistic side. So that would be my advice.